the four major polls since the campaign started. Week 1, Labor leads 54.5 to 45.5. Now week 2, 55-45. Week 3, 55-45. Week 4, 55-45. And week 5, 55-45. I think they're trying to tell us something. Now the primary vote, and keep an eye on the coalition's primary figure. Week 1, Labor, 46.5 to 41. Week 2, 48-41. Week 3, 47.5-41. Week 4, 46-41. Week 5, 47, and you guessed it, 41. The coalition's primary vote has not shifted 1 inch. But in one sense at least, the campaign only got started this week when the major parties finally had their official launches. So here now are some of the key messages from John Howard and Kevin Rudd.
This election is about the future of our great nation, not the past.
Mr Howard has no plans for the future because he's not going to be there to deal with the challenges of the future.
I want to pursue with relentless vigour the goal of full employment.
If elected, we will abolish work choices.
There are storm clouds gathering on the horizon when it comes to economic management. And if we get it wrong, the prosperity we've enjoyed over the last 11 and a half years can be severely compromised.
I have no intention today of repeating Mr Howard's irresponsible spending spree.
A re-elected coalition government will introduce a new tax rebate for education expenses, including, crucially, school fees.
Over the next 4 years, a federal Labor government will fund an additional 450,000 training places across Australia.
If we have a nation for the first time in its history with a Labor government at every level, coast to coast, wall to wall, without let or hindrance, isn't that a huge risk?
I stand before you ready to deliver that new leadership for Australia's future.
But what does that new leadership really mean? Kevin Rudd is the first leader in 3 elections not to come on insiders during the campaign and defend his policies. When it comes to media accessibility, at least, Kevin Rudd is a long way behind John Howard. We'll try and figure out why that is so when the panel joins us shortly. But in his absence, we will be joined by Labor's Deputy Leader, Julia Gillard, right after the news headlines. And for that, it's Good Morning, Kath McKenzie.
Thanks, Barry. Good morning. A big search is underway in East Victoria and southeast New South Wales for a missing light plane carrying 4 people. Meanwhile, in Western Australia, a man's body has been found at the scene of a light plane crash near Onslow in the state's north. A new opinion poll out today has Labor picking up 18 marginal seats across the country, enough to win the election. 10 of those seats are in New South Wales, including the Prime Minister's seat of Bennelong.
For John Howard to actually pull this back to win the election is a very, very big ask, and that the probability is that we're looking at a narrow Labor win.
The Labor leader, Kevin Rudd, will begin the final week of the campaign in Melbourne. The Prime Minister is in Sydney. The UN Secretary-General has challenged governments around the world to act on a major new report on climate change. Ban Ki-moon says the evidence for climate change is unequivocal and that change already underway is more frightening than any science fiction movie because it's real. And the Australian netball team returns home today as world champions. Australia claimed its 9th title yesterday, beating New Zealand 42-38. Barry, I'll be back with more news at 11 o'clock.
Kath McKenzie, thank you. Well, as I said earlier, Kevin Rudd was invited onto the program during the campaign. We have interviewed the Prime Minister and the Treasurer, and up until Wednesday we were led to believe that Kevin Rudd would be joining us this morning, but instead his deputy is appearing. And good morning.
Good morning, Barry.
Well, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Do you think, though, as Kevin Rudd gains more experience, that he'll come onto programs like this?
Barry, Kevin has routinely been on the insiders. I've frequently seen him sitting in this chair opposite you. He's obviously done a large number of...
Once in 12 months.
Well, he's done a large number of interviews on the ABC. He's been on the 7:30 report twice, on Lateline. fronting up to Chris Ullman on AM in the morning. You know as well as I do that if leaders took all of the media commitments they were asked to do, that the election campaign would go 6 years, not 6 weeks. But I'm very happy, Barry, to answer any questions you've got.
We did give him 6 options, of course. There were 6 Sundays in the campaign.
Well, Kevin has to make choices. Obviously, he gets asked to do a lot of media interviews. He does have to make choices. There's only so many things you can do, and he does a lot of them. I'm very happy, Barry, to answer any questions you've got on behalf of the Federal Parliamentary Labor Party.
And we will. And he's doing Rove tonight, of course, so you must be chuffed that he asked you to do the politics while he does vaudeville.
Barry, I'm here to answer your questions. So there's 2 ways this interview can go. You can act like a jilted lover and we can do that for several minutes, or you can ask me whatever political questions you've got and I'll answer them.
Let's get started.
Rove is obviously a good way of engaging with voters who, with the greatest respect, Barry, don't get up on this time on a Sunday morning and watch the political shows.
OK, why was Labor's campaign launch delayed 40 minutes? What went wrong?
Look, I'm not sure about this issue of delay. It all seemed to me like it was rolling out on the timing it was supposed to roll out on. So we were there and we were ready to go and we did it on the timing we were asked. So I'm really not sure where the whole delay issue came from. There may have been some, sort of logistic hitches with sound or whatever. But
Sky TV were given an indication of a time and it was 40 minutes beyond that. You made a lot of Tony Abbott's 30-minute delay at the press club. The Sky TV had a live audience waiting to go. When Kevin Rudd was asked about it during the week, this is what he said.
Mr. Rudd, why were you late yesterday?
Well, actually, I wasn't even aware that I was. I was just waiting for direction to come in.
Oh, really?
Now, that defies credibility, doesn't it, that he's about to give the most important speech of his life and he didn't realise that he was 40 minutes late?
Well, I was there, obviously, with Kevin. I introduced him and we went out on stage at the time we were asked to go out on stage. If there was some misunderstanding with Sky TV, Barry, frankly, I don't have those details. Obviously, Kevin was out there at the launch talking about new leadership, talking about the issues that matter to Australian families, ratifying Kyoto, abolishing work choices, our plans for health and education, and the launch was very well covered and I think very well received because he was talking about that fresh approach for the nation's future.
I asked the Prime Minister this question 2 weeks ago and I'll ask you now, what do you think has been the cut-through issue in this campaign?
I think work choices and our plans to replace it with a fair and balanced system has been one of the single biggest issues. It's not the only issue, but as I move around this country, and obviously I've done that a lot in the last 5 weeks, talking to Australian working families, the sense of insecurity that work choices has brought has joined with their concerns about cost of living pressures. They feel like they're under a double whammy. They could lose basic conditions at work. Cost of living pressures are already on them. It's mounting insecurity and it's made them very worried about the future. And then the government's lack of plans for the big picture issues of the future, its failure to ratify Kyoto, its failure to have any real plans for the future of health and education has also worried them.
But this talk now of restraint, will that continue into government? Do you accept that spending generally has to be reined in the foreseeable future and this is not just a campaign line?
Barry, I've served on our Expenditure Review Committee in this period. Obviously, we've worked hard to look for savings in the Commonwealth budget. We've identified $3 billion worth of savings. Lindsay Tanner has obviously led that work and the Expenditure Review Committee has worked with him. In government, we'll have a comparable process. We believe you should be looking for savings. We obviously want to keep a prudent approach on the Commonwealth budget. We'll continue to do that. This is in contrast to Mr Costello and Mr Howard, who haven't looked for savings and haven't submitted any savings during the course of this campaign.
When Kevin Rudd said, though, in the campaign launch that he'd heeded the warning from the Reserve Bank, so what happened at the last minute? What cuts did he make?
Kevin Rudd indicated he'd heeded the warning of the Reserve Bank, that he wanted to take a prudent approach and he wanted to make sure that the announcements we were making were announcements that would make a difference to the long-term productive capacity of the economy.
It implies that he made last-minute cuts from the Monday when the warning was given to Wednesday when the speech was delivered. What areas suffered as a result of those?
Well, Barry, obviously you make choices about what's going to be in the speech, and when you do policy work you consider a range of options. What we wanted to deliver in the launch speech was a prudent plan for this nation's future. where some limited new expenditure went into the areas that would make a difference for the long-term productive capacity of this country. That's why we want to invest in the future of the kids that are in school today, to make sure that when they're the workers of tomorrow, they present with the best possible set of skills. So Kevin's balance at the launch was to say limited expenditure in the areas that matter most.
I'm just wondering though, in those last minute cuts, was the education revolution part of that? Because in the end, less than $4 billion was committed to that. That does not seem enough money to launch a revolution.
We've always said about the education revolution that it would come in chapters and that there would be more work to do than could possibly be done in 3 years of a government. That we've had 11 years of neglect. You can't make that up overnight. You've got to make it up over time. Our education revolution is there for people to consider. We've signalled our intention to make education the core national priority. We've got a suite of policies out there, from the education of our smallest kids in preschool and kindy all the way through to universities. Of course, in government we will continue a focus on education, and we will continue as we work through policies to have education at the forefront of our minds.
Kevin Rudd hasn't mirrored the government's rebates for education expenses, but he nevertheless said he didn't have a problem with the rebate, and he didn't have a problem with it not being means tested. Are you in that camp as well? You don't have a problem with giving these sorts of rebates to millionaires?
We selected, when we did our rebate system, focusing it on the tools that kids need for the future of learning, and I think that was the right direction.
Yeah, that's what you've done, but I'm not asking you about.
Prudent policy.
I'm not asking you about your priorities. I'm asking you about why are you in principle in support of something like that? Well, that you could give a rebate like that to millionaires?
Look, Mr Howard can put his policies out there. Obviously what Kevin is saying is that means testing isn't something that comes to the forefront of his mind when we're talking about education, but we made a deliberate choice to invest in the tools that kids need for the future. We want Australian kids to be working at their desks in senior secondary school with a computer integrated into what they do. Not some special class where you run off to computing, but so it's part of everyday learning.
Yeah,
and then we want to
sure,
give families support to
get
that laptop at home.
But I just go back to the point that when he was asked about that in principle, he said he had no problem with it, and I just wonder what that says about the future when you say you practice restraint, but you don't have a problem with that sort of a principle.
What that says is that we value the education of every child, and we will continue to do that. And we want to make sure kids right across the country, irrespective of what family they're born into, whether they're in the centre of the city, the outskirts of our suburbs, in a regional centre or in outback Australia, that they all get the support that they need for their education. We've made a set of choices which I believe have been the right ones. We want that early learning right in preschool and kindergarten. We want to give them the tools so that they can get the education that will be relevant for this country's future. We want to make sure our university system is strong. We want to focus on technical and further education through trades training in schools and more places in technical and further education. They're the right choices for our education revolution, and we've delivered the detailed policies that back them up.
Okay, if interest rates go up again early next year, and then maybe again before July, will you cancel or at least reduce the tax cuts?
We are committed to delivering all of the promises we've made during this campaign.
No matter what happens with interest rates?
Well, we've made them understanding the environment we're working in and having heeded the warnings of the Reserve Bank. And that is in sharp contrast to the government that had the Reserve Bank warn it more than 20 times about capacity constraints in the economy, skills and infrastructure, and then basically doing nothing. And also in sharp contrast to Mr Howard's spend-a-thon at his campaign launch, which was within hours of the Reserve Bank warning, and there he was, $9.3 billion in 20 minutes, an extraordinary amount of money.
Yes, but then again, he had 2 hours to reflect on the warning. Kevin Rudd had 2 days, so I guess he had that advantage. But my question is if interest rates go up twice before the tax cuts are to be delivered, there'll be the sense of urgency, won't there, about inflation, and it'll be all shoulders to the policy wheel, and yet you're not giving yourself any flexibility on the tax cuts.
Well, can I just say about Mr Howard, engaging in a spend-a-thon is what Mr Howard does. He did it before the 2004 election. He's doing it now, and we've had a very significant Auditor General report during this campaign about how they shovel money before elections in a desperate attempt to try and win them. What have we done in contrast? Well, we have heeded the warning of the Reserve Bank. We've looked for savings in the Commonwealth budget. We've come out with policies that we believe are the ones that will make a difference to the productive capacity of the nation. It's all about the future and all about making sure we keep downwards pressure on interest rates and inflation.
Well, with that in mind, can you give a commitment that when you amend work choices, there will be no wages breakout?
I can give an absolute commitment that there's nothing in our industrial relations system which will feed, to use your terminology, a wages breakout. Our system is about having a safety net for all workers that can't be stripped away, and then it's about bargaining at an enterprise level, making sure that if your enterprise is productive and there are gains to share, then they are shared, but in enterprises where there are less productivity outcomes, that you don't have a wage outcome imposed from outside your enterprise. Mr Costello wanders around with a desperate fear campaign saying under Labor, a wage outcome in a mine in the northwest of the country could affect a shop in Melbourne. That is nonsense. Wage outcomes will be based on the enterprise. You would expect strong areas like mining to do, well. They're doing well now. Their wage outcomes cannot affect wage outcomes in other enterprises.
No, but
just
nevertheless, does it cross borders? Because the economy can be different in different states. Productivity levels can be different in each state.
Exactly. And productivity levels can be different in different enterprises, which is why you have to be bargaining at an enterprise level. If we are doing exactly the same job,
But by that I
Barry,
mean, is there potential for the enterprise to cross borders, and therefore you'll be taking wage decisions that affect that are the same in different states?
No, the enterprise is the workplace level. It would be possible, Barry, for you and I to do exactly the same job. You're in one enterprise, I'm in another. We bargain and we get different pay outcomes because your enterprise is doing well and you're working more productively than I am.
Okay, you've been critical of the Prime Minister for saying that working families in Australia have never been better off. When have they been better off than they are now?
Well, working families didn't used to confront work choices. They didn't used to be at risk of walking into their workplace to be confronted by an Australian workplace agreement which takes away basic conditions. Working families didn't used to be confronted by walking into a workplace and not knowing if this is the day that they're going to be unfairly dismissed. Working families didn't used to be confronted with the pressure of wondering to themselves whether the kids would ever be able to afford a home of their own, as housing affordability in this nation has plummeted. And working families are right to be concerned about the shape of our health and education services and to be heartily sick of the Howard government playing the blame game with state Labor governments.
In government, will you revisit the issue of compulsory student unions?
What we've said on student services is that we would support students voluntarily coming together to advocate what they believe in as students so that they've got a voice in university structures. And we've said that we would work with universities to make sure that there are support for services. Obviously, what the Howard government has done is it's ended any form of student voice and its policies have jeopardised student services, including very basic things, dental care, childcare, student welfare services. We want to make sure that those services are available for Australian students.
So it's advocacy rather than unionism. Is that a union when you're not having a union?
It's voluntary coming together to have a say about issues. We support students having a voice if that's what they seek to have. The Howard government's done everything it can to stop them being heard in any setting.
I want you to have a look at a video now that's gone up on the Liberal Party website this morning. They're putting it on YouTube. You'll recognise part of it from an advertisement that's already been running. They say that it's April 1998, outside the High Court in Melbourne. Hearings into the waterfront dispute are going on, and that's Josh Bernstein, who was acting for the Maritime Union, and then you're distributing some documents. Can you tell us what's going on there?
Oh, look, I certainly can. Barry, you would remember the waterfront dispute. I certainly do. It was when the government, the Howard government, conspired to ensure waterfront workers were sacked and that dogs and security guards wearing balaclavas were on our waterfront. I thought that was wrong then. I think it's wrong now. What I did in those times is I was working for John Brumby as his Chief of Staff. My friend Josh Bornstein took on the case that was central in the dispute, a case he won when it was found that the other parties had acted illegally. He was obviously under great stress and strain when he originally mounted that case. I assisted him one weekend to try and keep the media at bay as he got about his legal work. And what that footage shows is me assisting him, obviously, one morning when he's doing some proceedings in the federal court in Melbourne.
Because you said on Adelaide
there
Radio
just
that-
handing out some documents for him to waiting journalists.
Because you did say on Adelaide Radio you were not a lawyer for any of the parties involved in that dispute, but to make the distinction that you were volunteering.
I didn't
do some media work.
No, I didn't do any of the legal work, Barry. I was not engaged as a lawyer at that time in my life. I didn't do any of the legal work. I'm a good friend of Josh Bornstein's. I'm a good friend of his today. He started out that case in difficult circumstances where he was basically doing it by himself for a period, as well as trying to do the legal work. He was having a million media calls on his mobile, and he just needed a little bit of a chop out from a friend, and I gave him that chop out.
In a recent interview, Therese Raine said that in her view the most important characteristics for a Prime Minister were compassion and a sense of justice. Where was that compassion and where was that sense of justice when Mohammed Hanif was being detained in Queensland?
In relation to the Hanif matter, you know, of course, that the Minister for Immigration ultimately cancelled his visa on character grounds. We as the opposition do not have available to us all of the material that goes to the Minister for Immigration when he makes that decision. We said we accepted that the Minister was acting on good faith on the basis of the information he received. Now, of course, there have been more revelations about what was at the base of the Hanif matter. We've said that there should be a full inquiry into the circumstances.
But there hasn't been a word, though, since from Kevin Rudd on this. And can the country really have any faith in him that he will protect individual freedoms?
I think you can have a great faith that Kevin is going to do everything he can to keep this nation safe from terrorism. That is obviously a core obligation for all of us who are in the Australian Parliament, and it's a bipartisan approach. Every Australian politician wants to keep this nation safe from terrorism. That requires making difficult judgments in the balance on how we deal with policing matters in relation to terrorism, and Kevin's very equipped to make those difficult judgments.
On AM during the week, Kevin Rudd got into trouble when he was asked whether the Labor Party was any longer the Labor Party of the left. Given your background and your factional affiliation, do you likewise say it's no longer the party of the left?
I am a published author of speeches and articles where I say these labels have very little meaning anymore, Barry. I've been saying that for years. They hang off people, the media use them, sometimes we use them to describe each other, but they are really devoid of much meaning in contemporary times. The modern Australian Labor Party supports an open, competitive economy. We support a strong and growing economy, but we also want to keep that thing that's been precious about Australian society at the forefront, and that's a fair go for all. They're the balance of policies that Kevin Rudd has put together and delivered during this campaign.
What about the party of the left on social issues?
Well, to be a progressive party, you need to understand modern people's lives, modern working families' lives, the choices they make and confront. We obviously respect those choices and we want to help them. We want to help them by alleviating some of the cost of living pressures that have been so on people, and we certainly want to make sure that they don't face the insecurity that has been brought into their lives by work choices.
Well, I think increasingly, I think this certainly applies to John Howard and the Liberal Party. The leader moulds the party in his own image over time. Do you think that will happen with Kevin Rudd and Labor?
Kevin's a strong leader, and yes, of course, he will mould the shape of the government. He will have the party's support to do that. He's someone who's going to lead from the front. He's going to lead from the front on the things that matter, not only to Australian Labor, but to working families. We want to get rid of work choices. That's important to us and it's important to working families. We want to ratify Kyoto and deal with the challenge of climate change. We want to improve health services and end the blame game. We certainly want to give every Australian kid the best possible opportunity of succeeding in life. They're the things I believe in, they're the things Labor believes in, and they're the things Kevin Rudd believes in.
The Sunday Telegraph advocates a vote for Labor this morning, provided he stares down the party, that he drives the agenda and not the factions and not the unions. Will he do that?
He is doing that, and of course will continue to do that. This is a modern Labor Party with an approach that says the parliamentary party puts the policy together. We do that policy having listened to the concerns of working families, and unlike the Howard government, which has lost touch, we've heard those concerns loud and clear. They don't want work choices, we'll get rid of it for them. They do want better health and education services, we will deliver them. And they do want a government that's fresh and ready to deal with the profound challenge of climate change, and we will do that by ratifying Kyoto and all of our other suite of policies to deal with climate change in this nation and in international forums.
Thanks for coming in this morning.
Thanks, Barry.
After the first week of the campaign, my family and friends seem a little bit indifferent at the moment.
It's nearly Christmas and we want to see the buckets of money.
I think the campaign's been ridiculously too long.
In terms of best performance, I think Rudd has really had the media at his beck and call.
Eden Monero's a bellwether seat, and both parties will just keep throwing buckets of money at it.
We're getting plenty of money, but we need a lot more. In a sense, I still think Labor has given more buckets.
The policies, there's nothing that really sort of stands out. At the end of the day, you've got to have an economic plan and you've got to be able to manage that plan. And that, to me, is the crux of what my decision is going to be based on. The Howard Costello team, right, has, I think, got a proven track record.
That's bullshit. Sorry about that.
Do you think so?
Yeah, I bloody do.
Well, at the end of the day...
Well, if it ain't broke, don't
Well,
fix
because
it.
they've gone on growth, and Howard is still
what's
going
the-
for growth,
how
and
what's
growth
supposed to
leads
grow
for
the economy?
inflation. You've got your damn beer, haven't you?
Connie,
work.
I can't find people to work. I'm an employer, and I can't find people to work in my business.
And at the moment, economically...
Then look at education. If you can't find people, then they're being neglected.
Hey, all I want is a receptionist.
You can't tell me that bloody Howard stage
I'll
managers...
tell ya.
That Howard stage managers, mate, his media profile is so
Everybody
poor.
does, everybody does.
Rudd and he has to bloody walk into a room.
We're
and
looking at performance.
Performance-wise, Rudd's got him hands down.
It wasn't Eden Monero. Have the polls got it wrong? No, I don't think they've got it wrong. I think it's Rudd will win hands down.
3 weeks ago, I was intending to vote Liberal, and I will vote Liberal. Nothing from the Labor Party side has made me want to change my vote.
Without being affected by the media hype, I've resigned myself to the fact that I will still vote Liberal, even though I know that I honestly believe that Rudd is going to romp it in.
I still think Rudd is the best leader, and I think he's shown it, and he's young, he's in touch with the people, and he's prepared to say he's sorry, and that means a lot to me.
And Misha, she wanted the money, and she said that Kevin Rudd has delivered more of that than John Howard in the electorate of Eden Monero, at least, but that seems to defy the national trend.
It does seem to defy the national trend. But the interesting thing that I've found being on the campaign trail, and when you sort of drop behind the leader and the pack to talk to people in shopping centres or in a hospital, is the level to which policy specifics don't really land with people. So I think a lot of judgments still are being made in that land of the vague impression, the overall fleeting sort of sense of things, rather than looking very carefully at, you know, which party's offering $1,000 here or $1,500 there for an individual policy. There was a woman who, in fact, the woman who asked Kevin Rudd if she could have his kidney, which seemed to rather floor him, who said she'd pre-poll voted for Labor because of his hearing Rudd on the radio talking about carers payment. And we said to her afterwards, you realise that on carers, both sides are offering exactly the same dollars and same details. She said, oh, right.
Yeah. Though if there was a cut-through line for the week, though, it had to be Kevin Rudd saying that there had to be an end to this reckless spending.
I think that really was the story of the election. Not only that he could say that to an audience including Gough Whitlam and get a standing ovation from the Labor Party crowd that he would not spend recklessly, I think says two things. One is that he's been successful in at least selling this idea, and I think it's basically only an idea, of a Labor Party that won't spend recklessly, and the Liberal Party has been really lax in allowing that transition to happen. That line and that reception is far more convincing and far more potent than Mark Latham's clumsy attempt in the election before to sign that blank cheque. Remember, I won't...
But the difference is, it really doesn't matter whether
Yes.
the dollar. There's a great deal of difference between with the dollars. It was the signal that he sent. He was prepared to say, "Listen, I heard what the Reserve Bank had to say. This is my response." Whereas John Howard, who had, as I said before, 2 hours to respond to the Reserve Bank board, Kevin Rudd had 48 hours and a more considered response.
I think he had about 3 years because it was very obvious what the government tactics would be because John Howard had employed them so often before, and that was to drive through every electorate on the back of a truck shoveling out money. Labor very carefully has adopted this guise of fiscal conservatism and played the Prime Minister's tactic back on him. It's just one of the several areas where they've preempted the government as if they've actually thought about this campaign.
Well, I think that's right, but how much of it's spin? I mean, whoever wins the election will be spending $1 trillion, I believe the figure is, over say 4 years or 3 years. The difference between the two is $4 billion in $1 trillion. I mean, it's zero.
And the tax cuts, as Julia Gillard made clear then, will go ahead, even though the tax cuts were committed before the Reserve Bank said this has got to stop.
Yeah, I know. Look, all of this is like a parallel universe to the reality. You have a Labor Party saying we're the true fiscal conservatives in this land that's going to hell in a handbasket with everyone under terrible pressure, when in fact, it's economic sunshine. Yeah. It's just ridiculous. But Labor has been so successful. It's just brilliant.
Well, it's people looking for a reason to vote against John Howard because they decided a long time out that the Howard era was over and that one way or another he was going to go. Now they're sitting there saying, how do I justify this?
I think that's absolutely right. And essentially, it was lost for the Liberals. I mean, obviously, the election could go either way, but I think Labor has certainly won it. Essentially, it was lost for the Liberals when Howard refused to go. And therefore, there's only one party offering a non-Howard leadership, and that's the Labor Party.
And that point about people sort of looking for a reason to justify it, you know, you hear this often from coalition MPs, oh, there's not that visceral hatred out there, we're not getting that sense that people are furious. But that would explain it, because there must be, in at least some pockets of the electorate, this sense that people have quietly moved on, not in a, you know, up in arms kind of way.
No, it's just
you have to hate to want to change.
Taking the uncle to the door has just stayed too long.
It's like a guest that's on your couch. It's past midnight. You've got to work the next morning. And you're still there. You don't hate them. You just want them gone.
Is that the time?
We'll get some background and analysis now from Paul Kelly, political commentator with The Australian. Paul, good morning. How did you? Well, you've scored each of the weeks for us. How did you score week 5 in the 6-week campaign?
Well, I think week 5, Barry, saw Kevin Rudd no doubt emerge stronger than John Howard. I think Labor's policy launch was a more effective launch. And of course, the Rudd change of tactic and the embrace of expenditure restraint was a clever move, which I think was certainly the right tactic for Labor. Rudd continues to be a very effective front runner, and I think Labor's got the momentum. The momentum continues to be with it. The government is also plagued week after week by its past. And this week, of course, we saw the Auditor General's report into the regional partnership scheme, which was damaging. Then we saw Mark Vail's attack on the Auditor General. So all this is counterproductive. At the end of the week, the 3 main polls are all showing Labor in a winning position, although one of them shows the situation to be very tight indeed. So I think Labor overall is satisfied with the way the week went.
So let's go to the coalition's launch first of all. Then, what did you make of that?
I thought John Howard's policy launch was a very strong pitch for working families. And there was once a time when this sort of policy launch delivered by John Howard would have had a lot of impact. It was a big spend, geared very much towards home affordability and childcare, designed to counter Rudd's initiatives in those areas, but also a major Howard initiative in terms of the education tax refund, covering all school costs, including fees, pitched to both the government and non-government schools. This is about Howard's values. It's an ideological wedge against the Labor Party. The interesting thing is that it didn't work. Labor didn't take the bait. And I think this is an example of a policy from Howard that would have had a lot more traction a couple of years ago than what it does now. There were problems for Howard in this policy launch, in particular the mixed messages. He warned that there were storm clouds facing the Australian economy, yet on the other hand spent an extra $9 billion. And I think that difficulty in terms of the messages is a problem for the government. And I think the other point I'd make is that I think Howard's capacity to set the national agenda in this election campaign seems to be diminishing. And there's a sense here that his authority as Prime Minister is weakening. and that is clearly a problem for the coalition.
Well, in Kevin Rudd's launch, Andrew identified it as perhaps the most significant moment in the campaign when he talked about the reckless that the reckless spending would stop. What did you think of it?
A very big moment, no doubt at all about that, Barry. Rudd threw the switch to restraint. He did have an advantage. His launch was 2 days after Howard. It came on the Wednesday as opposed to the Monday, and I think that was a very substantial advantage for Rudd. In the policy launch itself, he underspent Howard by 75%, made this the virtue, depicted himself as the Reserve Bank candidate, talked about economic responsibility and said that he, Kevin Rudd, would never engage in this sort of irresponsible spending spree. I think all this was very clever and very astute. The point to make, of course, is that Rudd getting the best of both worlds here, because he's done his spend. To this stage of the election campaign, he's basically matched John Howard dollar for dollar, particularly on the tax cuts, and here in week 5 he suddenly turns around and depicts himself as the leader of fiscal virtue, but he got away with it. I think it was an insight into Rudd as a politician. He's very pragmatic, he's very flexible, and he'll finish this election campaign talking about restraint and responsibility.
Well, this is my last chance to ask you this question before polling day. How do you think it will unfold?
Barry, we've got the last week ahead of us. The last week in any election campaign is always the most important week. After 5 weeks, there's no doubt that Labor has campaigned more effectively than the coalition, and that Rudd has been a more effective campaigner than John Howard to this point. Rudd's been disciplined, he's minimised his mistakes, he's projected this image of new leadership, a younger, fresher leader. He's been remarkably free from intense media scrutiny. John Howard's difficulty is that there's the impression that his political career is virtually over and that it's time for a change, and all the time he's fighting that. At this stage, one has to say that Kevin Rudd must be favourite to win this election. I don't think the contest is over. Labor needs to get a very substantial national swing to win. It needs that swing in the right place. Labor can still get 51% of the vote and lose. So Labor's task in the last week will be to maintain its momentum.
Paul Kelly, thank you very much. And just on that question of the Kevin Rudd's approach and talking restraint, Peter Costello was, of course, unimpressed. This is what he had to say about it.
Kevin Rudd has never balanced a budget, never repaid a dollar in debt, never supported tax reform, never promoted small business, never defended free enterprise. And this is a government that's been doing it a lot longer than Kevin Rudd, who discovered economic conservatism sometime a few months ago after he was fed the line by an advertising agency.
You can sense the frustration there, though, because surely Kevin Rudd has boosted his economic credibility to an extent. But what he did through that manoeuvre, I think he made it tough for John Howard from there on in, that John Howard couldn't go around the country now saying, I've got some more money for you.
That's exactly right. And so when we saw the final chapter of the Coalition's health plan, for instance, this week, we had been expecting a much bigger spending exercise. We thought we would get a figure, and a dramatic figure at that, for how much they would spend on the next hospitals agreement with the states over 5 years.
That's the bit that's missing, isn't it? That's the bit that Kevin Rudd took out.
It was, you know, that page had been removed from the document. So both sides now are hampered in. And on the other side, you know, Kevin Rudd promises an education revolution. Well, maybe they focus tested education incrementalism in the focus groups and thought that wouldn't fly, because it's not a large, dramatic program, really, that we've seen so far. Now, maybe, you know, if Labor win government and they go on, we might see more unfold on that sort of front, but certainly not at this point.
Well, elections are not decided by formal campaigns alone, but by performances over the previous 3 years. So let's take a moment now and reflect on the short history leading up to election 2007.
I am truly humbled by this extraordinary expression of confidence.
The ongoing speculation is damaging the party. Stand clear, please. Our conclusion is that I should look after my health and pursue a normal life outside of politics. Therefore, I've decided to resign both as Labor leader.
This is a government department under siege. Since the wrongful detention of Australian resident Cornelia Rao,
So why shouldn't people know about such a two-faced stance?
I've decided that the time has arrived for me to step down as Leader of the Nationals.
Australia has come a long way, but we can't stand still. It's why we're introducing Work Choices.
If John Howard was nervous this morning, he wasn't showing it. The third and final member of his government to front the inquiry.
By seeing two senior ministers appear, this government has demonstrated its transparency.
It was supposed to be a dignified homecoming for a fallen soldier.
Have you got his body?
They were angry and they dished it out to me, and I don't blame them.
My commission is terminated, and caucus has decided to change leadership to Kevin Rudd.
I went purely as Mr. Graham Edwards' guest, and I stand by the statements I made the other day.
About the email?
Got to go.
I would probably, I'm certainly formed the view well into my term that it would make sense for me to retire, and in those circumstances I would expect that Peter would take over.
What evil befalls me?
It's the interest rate rise Australia had to have, according to the Reserve Bank.
Their interest rates have gone up 0.25%.
This decision will hurt some home buyers.
We know that people are listening in a way that they haven't been listening in quite a long time.
Ultimately, we'll all find out whether it's not all been an interesting exercise by the Australian public with its innate sense of humour.
Within the next perhaps hour or so, he's expected at Edinburgh, and then perhaps in the hour after that to be here at Yatala Prison, where he'll be in the maximum security division.
Right now is this country witnessing one of the most embarrassing acts of injustice in many years. And one other question, where is Kevin Rudd? What does it take for the federal Labor opposition to challenge the government on a matter of national security?
It is not about taking away children.
Any one of the many initiatives would make front-page news on their own. A ban on alcohol, the scrapping of the permit system, conditional welfare, compulsory health checks for kids.
In the end, what greater responsibility do you have than the care of children?
I believe he's just about heading towards us down Russell Drive. There's a little bit of scattered applause come out. Here we go. Election 2007 is underway, Barry.
And of course, since then, Andrew, the Labor Party's made it perfectly clear they're no longer the party of the left. That sort of talk is of no value.
I think this is one of the greatest bits of spin that we've seen. I mean, essentially, we're asked to accept that Kevin Rudd has remoulded the Labor Party. That's essentially the issue of trust. Is it going to be a different Labor Party to the one of its history? Julia Gillard sits there. She can't even say the Labor Party's of the left when she's of the socialist left faction.
Actually, she's in the Ferguson left.
Well, Ferguson left. Sorry, thank you. She also used to be the national organiser for the Socialist Forum. Now, here is the big battle that we're going to see after the election. Kevin Rudd, his big challenge will be to insist on to Labor that it is no longer a party of the left. Otherwise, it's misled the voters. And that, in that tussle, will be the big battle of the Rudd government.
Well, we've just had a look at all of the major issues that have cropped up over the last 3 years. Let's look now at this week. And Tony Abbott was to the fore again when he made his comments about the best protection for a job essentially is the prospect of another job if you get the sack or whatever. Now, I'm sure you've seen the videotape, but you probably haven't seen the way that it now appears on YouTube. Here it is.
I accept that the Industrial Relations Commission doesn't have the same power to reach into the nook and cranny of every business that it used to have. I accept that.
Spoken by Tony Abbott for the Australian Labor Party, Canberra.
Magic.
It's a nice spin on the sign-off. Now, Brian Cortis, you'll remember Brian Cortis, who was a member of the Hawke government, the member for Hinkler, now doing ads for the Liberal Party. He's part of it.
Farmer and former Hawke Labor government member Brian Cortis
I've known Kevin Rudd for 20 years.
talks about Kevin Rudd and the unions.
Kevin Rudd couldn't go 3 rounds with Winnie the Pooh, so there's no way he could stand up to the union bosses.
And Of course, Brian, I think Kevin Rudd has pointed out that he hasn't seen or met Brian Cordes in 10 years, but nevertheless, I'm sure it'll have some impact up and down the east coast of Queensland.
I'm not so sure, you know. I'm not so sure about that. The first one's interesting, though, that Labor thinks it's a way to attack the government by having a government minister say, well, everyone knows that the IRC and the whole industrial relations system can't go into every nook and cranny of every workplace and regulate to exist. Now, Labor thinks that's apparently bad.
No, I think the real attack was on the previous sentence, in fact, wasn't it, this week,
Yes.
where he said some protections in inverted commas are not what
But
they
that's
once
not in
were.
that ad.
No,
but that's not in that ad. That's what I'm saying.
But
This is a
the debate
statement.
centred in the papers and on the television for those 2 days about that issue.
That wasn't an ad. That was
being
just
stripped away.
Yeah, that wasn't an ad. That was somebody playing with YouTube.
Oh, well,
That's what it was.
well, even the ad bit where we had Kevin Rudd, Tony Abbott, going on that late line footage provided to Lateline by Labor, where his comments were spliced to make him seem like he agreed this was somehow some big, terrible mistake.
Without the bookends
yes,
saying, well,
exactly, without the big qualifications, as in the changes are going to make people, more likely to be employed and stay employed.
But it gave the government another headache in this
I think
final
that was run by
2-week
Lateline, by the
rundown
way.
period. Okay, well, but it gave essentially what it did tactically, though, is it gave the government another headache and another distraction, rather than being able to talk about its core message again.
But it was a media ambush, and I think there should have been an apology for that.
Well, you say that was a distraction for. I wonder whether the events in Western Australia were more than a distraction for Labor when Alan Carpenter, the Premier, had to sack Shelley Archer, and as a result, her husband, Kevin Reynolds from the CFMEU, also resigned from the Labor Party. Here he is.
I've got no intention of staying in the party or the way they've treated my wife. The party has just gone further and further and further to the right, and people see that, and that's why loudmouth, fat old men like me are probably better off out of it. So I'll get out.
Kevin Rudd would have been whooping
Hearing
hearing that crowd.
That should have come with an election disclaimer, shouldn't it? Written and authorised by Kevin Rudd.
I think that played very well for
brilliant.
Labor, but I think
Fantastic.
what didn't play so well for Labor was Mike Kelly's comments this week about the schools funding formula, and Labor were very lucky that more wasn't made of that.
But one candidate, a candidate I don't think that counted. I think that was much better for Rudd than...
Can I go back to the left-right divide? I think it's still very much there, in as much as you have this centralist concept of a Rudd government that you will buy computers. You will have computers coming out of your ear holes, and if you don't, we'll come into your house and make you buy a laptop for every
Central
child and the
Party
dog.
Committee will inspect it.
That's right. But on the other hand, Howard has made very much an appeal based on choice. There's the money, you could spend it on, private school fees, on textbooks, uniforms, laptops, whatever you want. It's up to you, you know best. I think that's quite a sharp distinction, and it's one that the government tried to make but couldn't quite get across.
But it didn't I don't think it was quite bold enough, because I think the $400, $800, $400 for a primary school student rebate and $800 for secondary, I don't think is enough to actually sharpen that divide, because everyone would probably spend about that much and qualify for that rebate, even if they didn't send their child to private school.
Of course,
that's where it would have really come in. But
as Paul said, they lobbed the wedge into the.
It didn't work,
and it didn't.
It didn't work. But again, this comes down to whether you trust a Rudd government to essentially be this non-ideological, managerial kind of thing, or whether, and this is the potency of Julia Gillard coming to your program. Kevin Rudd is managing the perceptions on a show like Rove, I mean, for goodness sake, while someone from the left sits here, Julia Gillard, the real steerman, it might be seen by some, to argue the policy. So is the Labor Party really going to offer a government of...
Well, I mean, Malcolm, what's your view? Is he skating into office off the back of inadequate scrutiny?
Look, I think he's... there have been attempts. There are a couple of factors here. One is that... a group of people whom I might gloriously call senior reporters don't travel often with the people, Misha accepted, of course.
Well, you know why that occurs.
And that is because it's very difficult, it's a very expensive process, and it's very difficult to take someone out of the show for a complete day for one doorstop, and a doorstop at which Rudd is very, very practised at not answering questions. So the rest relies on analysis of the public record and research as you can. We're talking during the election campaign itself. Plus, he's had this FM radio strategy which has worked very effectively, going for young people, and that's understandable. But also little things that both sides have, that they're no longer filmed doing radio interviews. They're just a voice on the end of the phone. And it reduces the sort of accountability.
The fact is, it's very effective. And just for the record, I have not declared or called for my colleagues to declare war on Kevin Rudd. If you read into the story, you'll see that I was quoting another senior journalist that suggested to me that this ought to happen. But nevertheless, I think there is a frustration that he's not doing enough of the longer one-on-one interviews.
It is, and it's really interesting to see that when he is doing the very barest minimum in the lowest risk areas where he can do it on the ABC. And it's interesting when he does, he fumbles quite badly almost every time. And you look at Chris Ullman asking him 3 times whether the Labor Party is a party of the left, no answer. Tony Jones asking him 3 times for a particular answer, didn't get one. Kerry O'Brien, it's like a competition, asking him 4 times the same question.
And it happens out on the trail as well, as Misha will tell you better than anyone.
And so you get the same answer. You get, working families are under pressure whether you ask the time of day or the price of milk.
That's not scrutiny, exactly. Now, in a show like this, he can't get away with that quite as easily, and that is why he doesn't front.
Now, we have to move on and have a look at some of the seats, but first of all, just before we do, I want you to have a look at this piece of footage and tell me who you think looks like a winner.
OK, joining us now is Health Minister Tony Abbott and probably hooking up with the PM today, Deputy Opposition Leader Julia Gillard. Good morning to you, Julia.
Good morning, Carl. Good morning, Lisa. Good morning, Tony.
Now,
dreadful.
Yesterday, an individual placed a $160,000 bet on Labor at $1.32 with Sporting Bet, I think it was. Now that Labor's down to $1.20. And the Liberals out to $4.50. But we'll have a look now at the seats where Sporting Bet have Labor likely to win, because they're favourites in these seats. And you've got the 5 there in New South Wales and just the 1 in Victoria. And then you've got 5 in Queensland, 3 in South Australia. And then you've got 1 each in Western Australia, Northern Territory, and 2 in Tasmania. Now, the interesting thing is how if the landslide is on, then the next 14 seats you'll now see come into play, because these are the seats where the Labor Party is $2.50 or less, and in some of those cases they're less than even money. So I suppose they are the critical seats that will really decide the nature of the contest on Saturday night.
Yeah, the terrible thing for the Liberal Party is that a lot of those seats include people that could potentially lead the Liberal Party, and I think that's going to be a tragedy for the Liberal Party in terms of trying to rebuild for the next generation.
Yeah. OK, more with Misha Schubert, Malcolm Farr and Andrew Bolt shortly, but it's time now for Mike Bowers, talking pictures this morning with Age cartoonist Bruce Petty.
Well, we saw the launches this week, Bruce, and promises are plenty as both sides of politics proves that there's no such thing as a free launch.
They get into this, that's sort of religious mode, isn't it, that one? I mean, that's sort of Abraham.
Seen the light! And here they all are, and aren't they just a fetching lot?
Yeah.
The husbands and wives.
Yeah, it's nice domestic symmetry there, isn't it? They're all matching pairs, and that's the way we should all be. No, in a weird territory where they are, competing for who's the most frugal person. We're not used to this territory, so it is a mystery.
Mr Zanetti I sense an air of desperation with the Prime Minister with free hugs.
Yeah, because they've tried everything. They've tried economic management, that didn't work, so it's down to free hugs. No, it must be really puzzling to have done what he's done, and it still doesn't work. Free hugs is the...
Mark Light, the Opinion Poll Dancing Club, he's got Mr Rudd outside it with "You are spending like a drunken sailor. You, sir, are a disgrace." With the HMA as Liberal and the Prime Minister just splashing around.
2 versions of vulgarity.
Aggregate impression. Run us through this, Bruce.
Well, Mr Howard would rather be referred to an aggregate impression rather than the truth. He thinks we're too pernickety about going for his actual words. What he means is to understand the aggregate impression. So do you swear to tell the aggregate impression, the whole aggregate impression, or nothing but the aggregate impression? I do, he said.
Howard versus Truth in the court of political spin here. It's a beautifully executed cartoon. I like it very much. The ever-disturbing Mr Rowe, who I've got to say is having a wonderful election when less is more, and he's got the opposition leader stripped down to nothing with just a little teeny sort of a dollar G-string on here. He's cast off his work choice bra.
Yes, there's a few messages built into this drawing.
New leadership, feel the freshness, and he's got the three old leaders here, Gough and Bob and Paul Keating and Paul saying so he did learn something at Scores, the nightclub.
Yeah, it's not a profound row, but it's got a nice look about it.
It's got a nice disturbing look.
Yeah, great chronological story, you know, the deregulation story, really. And you only need Mark Latham in there, you know, if you could get him to hold hands. I don't know whether he'd have done it, but it would have been nice.
It kind of looks like they've left space for him there.
Nice photograph, that.
Attracting the old vote here, the grey vote.
Yes, they're all there. T-shirts, they look a little bit out of character, but it's Kevin 07, quite clever. Whoever did that.
And this Loonig was just beautiful. I did like it very much. It kind of sums up the whole way that the launches are treated by not only the parties but the media as well. What happened to you? The Prime Minister, this big splurge. He did this big splurge all over me. How? He just opened his mouth and went blech all over me. That's terrible. And then the opposition guy goes blah all over me. What happened next? Then the media goes blook, blur, black, blork and blurk.
Yeah, that's Bloonig's understanding of politics in general. Feel for it, but I must say he's got some nice use of language there too.
Well, it's always a great pleasure talking to you, Bruce. Thanks very much.
Good.
Thank you. And we've had a 3-year-old, Sid. He sent in his book, Alistair's Elephant, because he said, well, it reminded him of Kevin Rudd. And if you have a look at the... it was written 20 years ago, you can understand the confusion. He says that Alistair was a very busy boy who had no time for nonsense. He worked very hard at school, and when he knew the answers to questions, he would raise both his hands. And then he would go to the zoo every Saturday because that's when they offered a special rate for kids. Alistair was thrifty too, so even the text
That is brilliant.
fits the picture.
How does it end?
Kevin Rudd, of course, doesn't raise both his hands. He only raises one at a time to wave in a very modest and non-hubristic way at the campaign launch.
Well, just before final observations, predictions, and it'll be your last before the election itself, let's look back now over some of the stranger moments in election 2007.
Here's the Prime Minister.
You blokes are a lot funnier when you pick on somebody who's alive.
No plan for the future.
Absolute waste of space. You are a disgrace.
We'll have a song together, won't we?
Hey there, Georgie girl, swinging down the streets so fancy free.
You're an ignorant bastard, both of you.
For the future, that's... do you want to wait for this to come back on, please?
Some lovely roses for you.
Here's something to help you keep your election up. It's called electoral Viagra, Mr. Howard.
Friends, that's bullshit.
My fellow Australians.
是1分钟之后就
C'est vrai que je parle français.
那个在旁边的
Et si vous êtes australien?
1分钟就开始 OK
I can't speak Mandarin, I must say, but I've eaten one or two in my time.
Hey, I mean, it's important. Hey, no, really.
OK, on that note, a final observation or a prediction?
I think there's the regional rorts scandal for the government this week was huge. It wasn't just a bit whiffy, it was a giant stink bomb, and it made Ros Kelly's whiteboard look like a rigorous scientific process for handing out public money.
A question of the campaign was from a young boy at Nambour High School who said to Rudd, "Is it true you got laid here?" There was no answer to that. Again, he didn't answer the question.
I think the battle for Labor after the election will be how to interpret the win in order to characterise what the party really stands for. Gillard made her push, it's IR. Kevin Rudd made his pitch in the launch. It's about economic responsibility. There's the clash.
Okay, and a final prediction. Kevin Rudd, as you know, will be appearing on Rove tonight, and I concede he'll have more than 1 million viewers. And Rove always asks, the final question is, who will you turn gay for? What will his answer be?
I'm thinking a little bit rock, a little bit cool politics. Bono, foreign aid guy.
Yeah.
Well, we all know he's a tart, so I think the entire United Nations Committee on Climate Change.
I think it'll be John Howard, because he's already wearing the guy's underpants. So.
I think he'll either say that he's too old to change his spots or Koshy.
Or
That's
too
it.
late.
That's it for this week. Jared Waitley will bring you Offsiders at 10:30, but first, here's Alan Collar and Inside Business.